Screen International. And I'm your host. And we have our presenter who I'm going to introduce, which is Joe Sterling Lee.
Hi, everyone. So I'm Joe Sterling Lee. I am a senior research analyst at Olsberg SPI, and really happy today to be kicking off the first in our webinar series. Part of my job is putting together every 6 months the Global Incentives Index, which is our kind of big guide to incentives around the world. I think today's discussion is sort of behind the scenes of that, looking a bit into some of the updates that we've included, as well as some of the trends that we're seeing, and then we've got some kind of ongoing developments that we'll touch on later on. So I've got a short presentation to run through first. So I'll just share that on my screen in a moment. There we go. So I'll just start with a quick kind of intro to Olsberg SPI. We're a specialist consultancy based here in London, but working all around the world. And we specialize in kind of screen sector policy and production policy. So we provide advice to clients ranging from governments to private clients, production companies, studios, on a lot of the issues that we'll cover today. So what's happening in incentives. We do a lot of work on incentive design, and then we also do a lot of work in incentive evaluation, so looking at the economic impact of different incentives around the world, alongside some of our other work. And I've got on screen just a few of the clients that we've worked with over the years. I just want to mention up front that we've got 2 recent reports that are kind of relevant to the topics that we're discussing today. So we recently published an update of our best practices in screen sector development report for the Association of Film Commissioners International, or AFCI. That has a large section covering incentives and best practices in incentives. And we also recently were commissioned by the MPA to update our white paper on incentives. That looks more at how incentives function, the different rules, some of which I'll be talking about today, as well as how to measure their impact. So if anyone's interested, please do have a look at those reports. I think they're very connected to the topic today. So just about this webinar, this is, as I say, the first in a series of webinars beyond the screen by SPI. So the plan is that we'll have lots of these webinars coming up, touching on different subjects. Today is about incentives, but we'll hopefully have more soon on kind of what's coming up and some of the topics that we'll cover. As I say, this is a bit of an expansion on some of the work that we do around the Global Incentives Index. This was published now last month in Screen International's World of Locations magazine. So this is our kind of big 6-monthly report, looking at, in some level of detail, all incentives around the world. And as I say, we'll be looking at some of the trends that are coming up, some notable updates from that guide, and then some ongoing developments that aren't in the guide because they haven't happened yet. And then we'll have a Q&A and a discussion at the end with Gabriella. And as Gabriella mentioned, please submit any questions and we can hopefully cover those at the end of the session. So just starting with some trends, we've been looking at incentives. We've been putting together this guide on incentives for 8 years now, so since 2017. And what we're seeing is incentives, or automatic incentives, which are triggered by expenditure. They're based on producers spending money in a jurisdiction and receiving an incentive for doing so. They're really growing and are in many ways the kind of most popular policy tool now around the world for stimulating investment and developing screen sectors. So when we started publishing the Global Incentives Index in 2017, there were 86 incentives around the world. And as of the most recent update in November, we counted 120 programs. So these, as I say, are programs where the funding is triggered in response to expenditure being incurred in a jurisdiction. There are lots of other funds and selective programs out there for film and TV, but we specifically are looking at automatic incentives here. So Yeah, that's the kind of broad trends, but we've identified for this session just three kind of top level trends that we're seeing. When we look at incentives. So one of those is the kind of rise of regional and city-based incentives. In some cases, these are kind of top-ups to national programs. So yeah, in lots of US states, there are cities like San Antonio and Savannah in Georgia and Oakland in California that are either introduced or are looking to introduce kind of top-up programs to the state level incentives. And we see some of these across Europe and LATAM as well. And then you also have programs like Sao Paulo's incentive, where there's no kind of national level incentive. But Sao Paulo is kind of standing in and providing a kind of large incentive to produce there, and it's not intended to be used in combination with anything else, at least in Brazil. The second trend is the increasing applicability of incentives to new production formats. So these formats might have been around for some time, but historically incentives applied to film, and then sort of over the last decade, pretty much every incentive applies to TV drama. But increasingly, we're seeing other sectors having similar incentives introduced. So video games incentives have been introduced in the UK and Ireland, and I'll mention one that's coming up potentially in Croatia. And then also formats like unscripted production, so reality TV and food programs and game shows and things like that. I think governments have recognized the potential of these projects to obviously incur expenditure, but also to provide some of the other benefits that film and TV generate. So there's more of a focus on bringing some of these additional formats into incentive programs. And then finally, we're seeing a renewed focus, particularly recently in some major markets like the UK and Ireland, on incentivizing local productions or domestic productions. So when we do our work for governments on screen sector strategy, we always see that it's really important to have both sides of an industry in a kind of healthy ecosystem. So international production and local production can play a really important role. There's obviously kind of in lots of markets issues around finance and so on for local production. So we're seeing more incentive programs being kind of increased or expanded to have additional value for those local productions. So next, I'll just move on to some updates from this most recent edition of the Global Incentives Index. This is by no means exhaustive. There have been lots and lots of updates over the last 6 months, far too many to cover here. But some of those have included, the UK, New York, Italy, Hungary, Australia, all kind of major systems with relatively big updates. Here we'll just focus on, I think we want to give a bit more of a global perspective. So we've got some other markets that I'll just run through very quickly here. So first off, I'll just mention Northwest Territories. This is a provincial incentive in Canada that has been around for some time, but it's always been a fairly small program. This year, the government announced an expansion of that program, so there'll be more money in the fund for the incentive, and then there'll be a second update in 2026. So the incentive will have annually 1 million Canadian dollars each year, and the incentive rates and some of the other rules have been adjusted. In the Cayman Islands, there's a new incentive that's just been introduced. It's a 15% cash rebate, but with several uplifts. So the value for a lot of productions would be more like 25 or 30%. Here, there's about $2 million that's been allocated to the incentive for the first 3 years. And there's a fairly kind of broad expenditure definition. So most production costs in the Cayman Islands will qualify for that incentive. So that's looking like a really competitive program being launched in the Caribbean, where there's a few incentives, but certainly not that many compared to the US or to Europe. So next, I'll just mention Portugal. Here, they've had an incentive for several years, and it's kind of worked for lots of different productions, but there's been a recognition that the budget's being exhausted, and there's a sort of discussion around the role of the incentive for domestic productions and for large productions. What Portugal has done is split the incentive program into two. So they've kept the original incentive and launched this new cash refund, largely modeled on Spain's incentive for larger productions. So the threshold for applying is slightly higher, but the value available is also higher. So there's 20 million euros set aside for that annually. It's a 30% cash rebate on the first 2 million euros of expenditure, and then it's 25% thereafter. And it has a higher per project cap than the previous Portuguese incentive. And then finally, just moving to Tasmania and Australia. So a lot of Australian states have their own kind of top-up incentives, and Tasmania this year has launched its own. So it's a 10% island screen incentive up to 500,000 Australian dollars. This can be used with Australia's federal incentives, and is another state in Australia putting in a kind of smaller program, but that acts as a sort of top up to the federal incentives. So those are just a few, as I say, updates from this edition of the index. I'll move on now to just some of the ongoing developments that we're seeing. So these haven't been, incorporated into the most recent index, but these are things that we're sort of tracking around the world. So I think maybe quite a few people have seen the news from California that the governor has announced they want to increase the cap of the Californian incentive to $750 million. That's more than double the current annual cap for that incentive. And I think the idea there is just to make capacity for more productions in California. The incentive is currently very competitive, and there's a lot of uncertainty from applicants around whether they will be able to access the funding. And it's competitive for large productions, and I think it's even more competitive for kind of smaller independent projects. Moving to Latin America, there's a new transferable tax credit that's set to be introduced in Ecuador. This is modeled on Colombia's very successful SENA program, and it's been a huge success in Colombia. It's unlocked a lot of funding for major projects as well as the domestic industry. And Ecuador is introducing something very similar. There was also recently an announcement in Peru that a similar program would be introduced there. So that model is being kind of replicated around Latin America at the moment. In the Caribbean, there's another transferable tax credit being introduced in Barbados. This will be worth 25%. It's been announced for a while, but it seems to be progressing. This is again kind of modeled on another in the region, so it's very similar to the Dominican Republic's transferable credit. It's worth 25%, but it will apply to a lot of production expenditure based on what's been announced. So it'll be a very competitive program in that region. I'll move over to Europe, where there's quite a few updates and a lot happening at the moment. In Ireland, I've mentioned that there have been a few changes recently announced, but one of them is a new incentive set to be introduced for unscripted productions. This will be one of the first kind of big markets to introduce a program for unscripted projects, and there's a process at the moment of sort of confirming that incentive with the European Commission. Once that's approved, it will be launched, and it'll be interesting to kind of see how that kind of works and whether it kind of builds an industry there, or supports some of the producers that are already active there. I also mentioned in Croatia that there's a new video game incentive being considered. This is at a very early stage, and we recently did some work for the Video Game Developers Association in Croatia. I think what's happened there is there's been, the film and TV incentive has had a huge impact, and the video games sector, which has video games and film increasingly have a lot of crossover in terms of crew and just the sort of production processes. Um, I think there's a move now to see whether a video games incentive could have a similar impact in Croatia, and so that's progressing um, at the moment. Finally, in Europe, there was recently an announcement in Denmark of a new incentive set to be introduced in 2026. Denmark is the last kind of major European market to not have an incentive, and actually, you know, the US, most US states have an incentive. Canada, most provinces now have an incentive, but in Europe, it's been, you know, with Denmark introducing this incentive, every European nation will have an incentive. Obviously, there are lots of kind of details within that. There are lots of different rules. There's not kind of one standard model, but yeah, Denmark is kind of the last European market to introduce an incentive, and I think the planned budget is around sort of $18 million, I think, for that one. And then just finally on these ongoing developments, Thailand has announced that they will expand the sort of the maximum value of the incentive to 30%. It's currently 20%, and this has been planned for a while, but just hasn't happened for various reasons. But the government, I think, 2 weeks ago or 3 weeks ago, announced that they would make this change and that the incentive would be expanded. And Thailand has had a lot of success over the years in location production, but is increasingly becoming more of an important market for kind of studio-based productions that are entirely made in Thailand rather than just going there for location filming. So as with updates that we covered in the last slide, this is just a selection of some of the things that are happening around the world. There are changes happening in Germany, Czech Republic, the UK, British Columbia, and lots of other places. But this is just a selection for today. But we'll leave it there, and I'll hand back over to Gabriella and the Q&A.
Sure. So we've had some questions come in. So I'm going to start with the first one I got, which actually I think is so interesting. The question from an anonymous attendee says, what recommendations do you have for documentary startups focusing on crisis regions worldwide and humanistic storytelling?
Yeah, so I think for documentaries, a lot of programs worldwide cover documentaries. And actually that's something that we do cover in the Global Incentives Index is the applicability of these programs to documentaries. With documentaries, they tend to incur less expenditure than a kind of major film production. So these incentives can make a big difference, but the kind of the budget considerations are often at a kind of different scale. So I think it's just about finding an incentive that makes a difference in the sort of financing process for the documentary, and can help get it made. I think, in lots of markets, one of the kind of great things about these incentives is they're not based on the content of the documentary or of the film. So it's as long as you have that idea and as long as you have a project to get made, a lot of these incentives will just be directly applicable.
One question that's just come through, which actually touches on something that Joe and I were speaking about earlier, is, are there any considerations for sustainability within incentives? I think that's so interesting because when we were talking about it earlier, there was the question of, well, is that the right spot for sustainability measures to be implemented? Is it through incentives? So Joe, your take.
Yeah, I mean, this is a really interesting area, and there are lots of, when we see incentives being redesigned, and particularly in this last sort of year or so, there's definitely a move to add, either additional value or requirements for productions that meet certain kind of green standards. So Austria is the one that's kind of top of mind for me. I think there's a 5% uplift in Austria for productions that. And I'd need to check the rules exactly, but I think it's for productions that undertake a kind of carbon calculator or carbon audit, and maybe meet some other kind of green filming requirements. Those projects can then access some additional value. And from our perspective, I think that's a great way of doing it, to kind of encourage those practices as opposed to potentially kind having a really kind of fixed requirement for every production. What we find with kind of really strict requirements is that most big productions can accommodate those because they have teams to do those kinds of things. But it can often be kind of tricky for independent productions to meet every standard. So I think there's definitely interest in this, and lots of incentives have kind of smaller rules around green filming. And I think, yeah, as in the same way that incentives are kind of built to encourage activity, I think encouraging activity in green filming through uplift seems to be the kind of successful model that we're seeing.
We have another question. Can you elaborate on the trend with local production? Where do you see it, and what are the reasons?
I mean, I think we're seeing it at the moment in the UK and Ireland. There are other programs that have, I mentioned Portugal, that also, sort of informally has now one system for smaller projects and one for larger productions. That's kind of the same thing is kind of happening in the UK and Ireland. And I think the reason that it's happening is the kind of market finance issues. There are kind of additional pressures on smaller productions in particular. And I think, outside of those pressures, I think governments recognize that, as I said, within a sort of healthy screen ecosystem, it's not just kind of one or the other. You don't just want domestic production or just international production. Having both gives, they kind of work in tandem. And I think that's kind of what's been recognized and why we're seeing, these, targeted policies being introduced for domestic productions.
I think that feeds really nicely into another question in here, which is how long do you think it will take for crew looking for work to see the benefit of these incentives? How long until things pick up? And I think to speak to your point, it's about that healthy ecosystem, right? The industry had a couple of big setbacks in the last few years and struggling to recover from that. The incentives are obviously looking to reinvigorate the industry, but what is the trickle down of that incentive into the people who are actually making the film or the show?
I mean, I think, with these programs in particular, they are very focused on expenditure, and a lot of that actually sort of translates into expenditure on crew and on we do something as a company called a ripple analysis, where we look at productions and see how they're spending. And one of the kind of unique features of a film production is that it spends in lots and lots of different areas. So when a production comes in, there's laundry and catering and crew, obviously, and construction, and all of these different areas are kind of where that money goes into, and that's kind of why these incentives exist, is to stimulate that investment. But I think also when we do our kind of wider work on sector strategy that includes incentives, we also really recognize that these are not necessarily the kind of solution to absolutely every issue in the screen sector, and there's still a lot of value in governments really kind of grappling with the problem of workforce development and making sure that there are kind of pathways for entry into the industry, upskilling and opportunities for people to kind of grow up the career ladder. So incentives definitely play a role in that, but there are certainly kind of other kind of policy measures that can really make a difference there.
We've got another one. How confident are you that these incentives do pay out in a reasonable time period? And are there any you would currently watch and wait on?
So I think, a lot of incentives pay out fairly quickly. The idea is that you spend the money and then the incentive is granted after that expenditure has been incurred. So they're usually not, some incentives have kind of upfront tranches of, they'll pay kind of once the initial approval has been given. Ireland has a system like that, and there are other examples where once the initial kind of application has been made, there's actually a kind of immediate payment. For most incentives, there's a kind of the production spends the money, does its own audit, hands the kind of the rundown of its production costs and eligible costs to the incentive agency. And in most markets, it's fairly quick, but there are definitely differences between markets on kind of the speed of how quickly that incentive reaches the producer. Um, with tax credits specifically, if it's a transferable tax credit, the producer needs to sell that tax credit to another company, and so there needs to be a healthy market for those tax credits. But we find even in markets like Colombia that I'm not quite sure of the year, it was maybe 2020 or 2021 that they introduced their tax credit. It's it's a we've seen a kind of very quick uptake within the market for buying these credits, and from what we know, there haven't been any kind of big issues with finding buyers for tax credits. So producers generally can the monetization process is usually relatively quick.
We've got another one. Have you examined how many of these incentives are adequately funded over the fiscal year, or if they are exhausting their budgets before the end of the year? And what would that mean for a producer looking into certain locations based on those incentives?
Yeah, this is certainly an issue in some markets. There's a lot of interest, from producers for these incentives, and to use Austria as an example, they've kind of solved this problem. Their industry has sort of been growing over the years, and it reached a point in, I think, 2022 where the incentive budget was exhausted. This was a problem for international productions, but even more so for domestic productions, which weren't kind of scanning other markets quite as much, and were really relying on this program. In Austria, what they've done is they've kept certain caps for the incentive, so projects can only get a capped amount individually, but as a whole, there's no kind of annual cap for the incentive, and that means that that all of those projects will be eligible. It'll just be only a certain amount, and that's been a huge kind of benefit to that industry, which can now kind of plan much more confidently what's going to happen. I think the incentives do have a lot of incentives have annual budgets, and they do sometimes run out. I think we do see that, but I think the thing to do as a producer is just to reach out to the incentive agency, just make sure ahead of time that that there's available funding.
I'm going to try and squeeze one more question in, which is, I note that many of this year's successful Southeast Asian projects have multiple country producers. Do you think they are still heavily in competition? I assume the regions and the incentives, or are the incentives working together more, i.e. Thailand, Malaysia, Philippines, Indonesia, etc.?
Yeah, I mean, we know that there is more kind of co-production happening in that region, and I think that that probably means that those productions are using multiple incentives when they're made. I mean, there's a lot of kind of collaboration between, particularly for local production, between sort of Thailand and Malaysia. There's a lot of kind of a shared crew base, so definitely we see a lot more kind of co-production there, which is really positive. And the domestic productions from those markets are actually kind of reaching international audiences that they haven't done so much in the past. So I think the incentives there really play a role. There's a lot happening in Asia in terms of incentives. Japan recently introduced an incentive. Thailand, as I mentioned, has kind of upgraded its incentive. There's been discussions of either an incentive or a relatively large fund in Indonesia. Philippines introduced an incentive a few years ago. So there's lots of options for those projects, and I'm sure that's having an impact on that kind of co-production market.
There are so many questions still left in this Q&A box. And I'd say for those who didn't get their questions answered during this chat, you can always reach out to Joe and to the team at Olsberg. They're wonderful and happy to help you in any way that they can. I'm speaking for Joe there. But we really appreciate everyone attending. Like I said, you'll all get access to a recorded version of this, so you can go back and watch for anything you missed. And thank you all so much for joining. Joe, if you want to say a final farewell.
Yeah, just thank you everyone for joining. And as Gabriella mentioned, please do reach out to us with any questions. We have a limited time today, but keen to kind of discuss these issues with anybody that's interested.
All right. Thank you all
Thank
so
you.
very much.